First of all, I mean, for those who've never been to a smashing hour is just an hour-long friendly conversation between an absolute expert from the field, generally someone that inspires us, or someone that has been on our radar for a long time, and between someone from the smashing team. So we've been working or been friends with Nathan for a while. You're just saying you were on a conference in San Francisco in 2017. Was that one of the first times you were with us, or have you been with us longer?
I've had like two eras with smashing.
Okay.
Presented at a number of smashing conferences from 2016 to 17. I think they were New York, San Francisco, and Freiburg. And then I was able to visit with you all again last year, or no, 2022 in Freiburg as well. But in between those times, I've been doing like workshops and so on. So I
Okay.
definitely value the smashing relationship that we have, and it's always been a really positive one with you and the team.
Nice. Well, that's great to hear. I mean, I remember you in Freiburg, and it was not just an amazing talk, but also a workshop that I was lucky enough to attend most of it. And I remember being quite overwhelmed with, I was a little bit like, God, you're organized. It gave me a little bit of anxiety, and a little bit of like, oh, there's so much stuff I don't know, and there's definitely a lot of organizational skills that I don't have. Anyway, for today,
I was going to share
I
one
have,
thing. My
yeah,
memory of that conference is
yeah,
a lot different
okay,
because that was the first conference. I've advanced in my career age-wise quite a ways, that my dad, who was traveling with me, attended and sat in the back of the crowd
true,
during the
true.
talk. And I think all of us that care about design systems and also have parents from whom you're looking for affirmation would find this funny, that my dad's reaction to my talk was, I saw you, like, I heard you talk about atomic design, but things smaller. Have you ever thought about framing your ideas instead of just atoms and molecules? Why not write about quarks? And I was like, Dad, just stop. No, we're not going to talk about quarks. I'm not going to break it down anymore like that. But it was a delightful experience for him as well.
Nice. We you obviously pitched that idea to anyone after that, because
No,
best ideas, no. Okay,
not
weird.
that one.
No. Anyway, I'm seeing some people in the chat already kind of mentioning where they're from, which is quite cool, because they always come from everywhere. Please also use the chat for posting questions. I'm gonna try and put your questions forward as well. Those that we can't do now, that require a little bit more thinking, we'll see if we can answer them afterwards. Maybe just to get things started. I mean, you've been in design systems forever. What's kind of like, if you look back 5 years to now, what do you think what would you say are the main things which have changed, especially for the client work that you do? So not so much um, in the thinking, maybe theoretically, but what you see with clients happening. What's the main changes?
I look at it almost as conveniently 5-year periods of change, where like from 2010 to 2015, we were doing design systems, we were setting up some teams, but that was mainly riding the wave of HTML5, CSS3, responsive design, and really helping people shift how they approach the design process. But that gave way, I think, or set the stage in 2015 to 2020 to really acknowledge design systems as a practice, to start to acknowledge that many companies can make an investment in a team to build a library and support it and maintain it over a period of time. And so that period really was one where there was a lot of writing and talking about, how do you pitch the value of the system? How do you identify a team to support it? How do you make the transition and deliver a generation that everybody starts to use, and think about fairly crude but initial stages of adoption? I feel like a lot of that is now tried and true. One of the things I'll measure implicitly is how many what I call system success story blog articles are there in the space coming out, and you see on Twitter or LinkedIn and so on. And there was really a spike of those in the 2017 to 2021. Everyone just using a blog post to express, I finally made it. I was able to set up a system. It all worked. But I sense those still happening, but tailing off. And so the last 5 years, like 2020 to now, I would say you're really hardening and expanding how design system teams operate, how they relate to much larger scaled organizations. Certainly there were starts of that before then. You know, Atlassian had a big team, Google had a big team, et cetera. But I'm seeing more and more across all my clients, teams of teams, and also not just supporting 0 code libraries or 1 code library, but many code libraries, iOS, Android, web, or React as a trio that's pretty common. And so you see the scaling of those things and the operationalization of those things. And you also see a lot more directors, product managers, other kinds of positions being advertised as a part of the design system space rather than just design system designer, design system developer, et cetera. And so you see a maturation of how it's being respected within organizational planning and its role. I
And is that
suspect we're
across,
just
is it
seeing.
across
Go
like
ahead.
size of organizations as well?
I think design systems have played a role across different kinds of organizations for a long time. Like some of my clients, like here in the United States, Verizon or Fidelity or Chase Bank, you know, they're massive. So they're that kind of reuse and scale. They're going to have a design system team. But I also see a lot of my smaller clients, often ones that I coach, they have like 1 or 2 designers, 1 or 2 developers. They're making it work. And they're also within a smaller part of the organization. And so I think I've seen a lot of that, but I also sense that there continues to be a need for organizations to understand, how should we consolidate these things? Can we have many different systems that live independently? That's often quite all right and actually serves the greatest business value to do that. And so I think that's okay too.
All right. So you're seeing systems within systems, or you're seeing kind of 2 separate systems living within one organization?
I think more the latter, where
Okay.
I was in a conversation earlier this week at one of my clients where I work amid a very centralized design system practice that supports a wide range of different product types. But one of the product types that isn't a customer of our design system has their own design system. And they've set up a very federated model. They basically have nobody dedicated to it. And so what the pair of designers are trying to do is have a Figma library, keep it up as best they can, and then just coordinate how code is being created in a consistent and reusable way across all their teams. So it's a very implicit central governance, but instead it's really relying upon everybody else. And so they look across the fence and say, oh my gosh, we so want a dedicated team. We wish we could dedicate all of our time to this. And from my side, I was like, oh my gosh, the centralized practice we're at here, I totally want to break down some of those walls and make it more federated. And so it's interesting how both of them were serving certain forces and tensions in the ways that their business operations worked. And they were both viewing the other side as having greener grass as a result. When the reality is they both have strengths, they both have weaknesses, and they both validly fit certain cases.
Is there kind? I mean, I'm sure when you get into a client where they don't have a design system yet, right? They've probably heard about both sides, right? And they want the greenest grass of all. Do you have certain kind of starting points or things that you start with, so you can kind of guide them towards decisions they make? So is there like a format or a number of questions, or one of Vitaly's checklists, or?
Yeah, I think there's a number, like, just to make it a bit more general a question, how do I, when I'm talking to a new client, very quickly try to assess where are they at in their design systems journey? Where are they mature or immature? And so I try to almost force them to give me very short answers. For example, what outputs does your design system produce? And I'm listening for, do you produce a design asset library? Do you produce a code asset library, like a React set of code packages? And do you have documentation of both those things? And are they all in sync? So that's like the outputs question. The next thing I ask, or maybe even before that, is what kind of features does your design system offer? And I'm listening for the obvious answers, which is summarized as a visual foundation threaded through a library of UI components. Okay, everybody has that. But then do they also say accessibility? Do they also say content? Do they also say UI patterns? If they're a marketing site, they often say page types. Whereas if they're a product organization, they almost never say page types.
Yeah.
And so that's from a feature offering, like what do you get? What kind of things are you making a library out of is another one. And then I'll ask what kind of people are working on it and what kind of ways do they interact? How dedicated are they? What's the size of the organization? At a big bank, it might be, we've got 40 people spread across 4 teams where the last 3 teams are the React, iOS, and Android team, and the design team has 15 people. I'm like, okay, that's mature. You have like a very big organization. But another person might say, one designer's just trying to fit this in with their product work and they're like not making a lot of headway with their developers. Okay, that's the opposite end of the scale.
Yeah.
So I try to think about what they offer, what they deliver, the features they offer, the outputs they deliver, and who's making it. And then we can get into some of the process and strategy and vision and that kind of stuff.
And I suppose again, there's really I mean the difference in the kind of project you run with a 40-person team will be completely different than if you're, I mean, if it's with one designer, it's probably more or less one-on-one coaching.
It can be, yeah. It's usually not just one person anymore. Like the smallest coaching or office hours clients I have tend to have some sort of design director or leader, tend to have some sort of senior designer that's doing most of the talking and owning of the design decisions. But then they often will convene other members of their community. So even from a smallest perspective, there's some sense in advocacy from leadership. There's some sense of embracing the community and some of your best friends or advocates of the system that aren't necessarily working on it. And so that's the start. Those are the seeds that you want to plant in order to grow and scale what you need it to be.
Yeah. And do you, I mean, I always find it in client work, it's hard once you've done a project, you're done, you kind of implemented what you want to implement, but you how do you know whether it becomes successful? Do you have a process for that, or do they follow up with you? How does that work for you?
Are you asking if the design system's successful or if Nathan's consulting is successful?
But I mean both. I mean, hopefully there's a link between the two. So if if you do the design system do well, you've done well, and they'll ask you again. But it's a little bit of both, right? I mean, for me, for example, when I was a teacher, it was if I did well, my classes scored a high rate, but in the end, it was about my students being successful, right? And a couple of years later, I would get a message from them on LinkedIn saying, this was amazing, and you helped me. So where does that come from you?
I think the 2 things I think about are the outcomes we can control and the outcomes we can't control. But you ultimately, you feel like when you're working on design systems that you can control what features you work on, what outputs you deliver, the cadence by which you deliver them and maintain them, because you take a product mindset instead of a project mindset.
Yeah.
And those are all things that if you have objectives, you can align your objectives with those kinds of deliverables and those kinds of incremental progressions of how the system is starting to evolve. That's what you control, and that you can designate success based on that. But it ultimately has 0 business value until the thing that most design systems professionals don't control, the integration of your system to achieve actual in production experience, digital experiences, that you really have to focus on too. And that is sort of a seesaw that I sometimes try to get people new to design systems to go from focusing all their attention on what are we making, how are we releasing it, to how are we advocating and ensuring that it's creating the business value and serving the shared needs of the organization, such that the ultimate outcome that I feel good about, going to the root of your question, is when I see the design system, me and the teammates I worked with, is actually impacting in production work. And that the thing that really tempers expectations realistically is not, is their digital ecosystem covered with your design system perfectly after 1 year? That's almost, it's never the case. But have you actually achieved business goals, and is that coverage significant in having a very positive business impact? Maybe 40% of the products or 60% of the products are covered by the design system. And that's good. That's great. That's success. That's not failure.
Yeah. Okay. So that's, I suppose for people who are relatively new to that, well, also these numbers don't sound massively high, but you, from experience, it's going to be hard enough to get to that number. So
Yeah,
that's
like
quite.
I've been around for long enough to have seen many of the very publicly prominent design systems evolve and grow. And so, like, you hook on to those stories by saying everyone pretty much is familiar with Google Material. When did Google Material start? It started around 2011 to 12 as a project called Project Kennedy. When did Google Material show itself to the world? 2014. I remember it was a Tuesday morning in September, and I got to my client and I opened up my browser. I was like, what the heck is this? This is awesome. Started just pouring over all that gorgeous documentation that they published at the time. That was 2 to 3 years after they started. And when did actually Google Material start to make its way into products like Calendar? 2018, 2019. So suddenly you're like, oh my gosh, Google does everything perfectly. They're so strong. They have limitless resources. They must be able to kick this stuff out fast. Well, actually, it took them from 2011 to 2018, I'm estimating 7 years for Calendar to become materialized purely.
Yeah.
So you have to set expectations in that way, that this is a long game that you're going to play potentially.
And I'm sure that I'm not sure if there's people who work for Google who are now in the list. That if you look internally, there's a lot of stuff still not done, or not done perfectly, or not 100% adapted. So yeah. That's that also makes us mere mortals, kind of always makes me a little bit happy almost.
Yeah, we're all mere mortals, including all the people that work at Google. There was another design system I worked with around 2018 where I learned a valuable lesson, where they had a lot of products. They think of it as a long tail of around 20 total products, but most of their revenue was centered around 2 or 3 big flagships. And so they went through this period where they went through a third generation of rebranding everything and recreating the design system from the ground up. And for that first biggest flagship product, it has all of its core screens, like list pages and detail pages and other kinds of very critical to success pages. And all of those got the treatment of that third generation. But then there were, and I think the count was 10,000 help pages for the flagship product. And everyone was like, well, to make this generation complete, we've got to apply it to everything. And if I recall correctly, the business was very astute to say, do not redo the help pages. The business value doesn't exceed the cost. Don't worry about it. Let's move on. Let's tackle the stuff that's going to create the greatest user value. And I would suspect, that was 6 years ago. It's probably been redesigned by now. But the fact that they were making good choices around what to choose to cover this with the system and what not to.
Yeah, that seems to make perfect business sense, and also shows you can't be too dogmatic. All right, I've seen some questions coming in, so let me just have a quick look. I see Sean. How many of those big teams who are investing in building with web components to better handle multiple framework support? They're early in building out a new enterprise-wide system, and the best way to handle Angular, Vue, and React is to use web components. What are your thoughts?
I used to be more opinionated about this. I'm less opinionated about it now. The first is the goodness of fit of using web components as a technology relative to where the organization is at. I had an experience at Morningstar, which is maybe my most intrinsically rewarding design system I've ever worked on. And I was there for 27 to 2018. And in 2018, we decided to go from a vanilla HTML and CSS bootstrap answer to build it in web components, because we saw in the ecosystem of all the products that used it, there was maybe 20% React, 60, or let's say 40% Vue and 40% Angular. And so we thought to ourselves, the only way for us to support all of them is to build with web components. And so we spent a year, and by the time it launched, I had tapered away and offboarded as a consultant. But by the time they launched web components, it turns out the organization had shifted without a dictation to 95% using Vue. They had normalized on their architecture to everybody use Vue. And so web components came out, 95% of the people were using Vue, and all of those people didn't want to have to integrate with a foreign technology, and it really created a barrier to contribution and evolving it. So they said, let's transform web components into Vue. So you have to know where your organization's going, and it has to be justifiably spreading across those. The kind of barriers that come to mind are how much will the tooling be centralized? If you want a broad federated array of contribution, then having a different technology than the technology they work in every day is going to be a barrier to that. Another one is how much will the design system be responsible for creating transformations or sort of wrappers to web components to make them work as smoothly within each of those different environments. And so there was another client in 2019 where they based it on web components. It was the right call, but there was a lot of also burden for the design system team to wrap it in certain ways to be consumed by the other frameworks. Since then, I got to be honest, I haven't really worked on or been a decision maker in that particular decision. And I've been surprised by web components' lack of uptake, but it's also because I've been in organizations where there's a North Star architecture of we're using React or we're using Angular, where you serve the needs of the clients that you have or the customers you have at the system.
Cool.
That's awesome. Thanks for the insight, Nathan.
Yeah. Is that clear enough, Sean, or you have a follow-up question for that?
No, that's great. I think that covers it. I threw in a little PS that was around like the mobile native piece, because like I see people, some people trying to use Flutter or React Native, but our mobile native apps are still written in mobile native. So I guess my assumption is that they'll be consuming our token structure, but we certainly can't, even if we go web components, we can't really help the mobile native side. So that's maybe not a question, but just commentary of like where my head's at.
Sean, I think that's actually, you raise a couple of good points. The first is that design systems are actually a system of systems, and tokens as a visual foundation threaded through components is a separately versioned package that people can depend on. And so I really like that you mentioned that, because that is a way to reach into other frameworks that you don't necessarily directly support. Another thing that I've seen teams doing is they have varying levels of strength with the relationships they have with different groups creating libraries across different platforms. And while it feels weird, like the value of specifications has increased in design systems, because you can, when you create specifications for each of your components and make those specifications in a way to be consumed by many different platforms, suddenly that becomes a better bridge to the teams you communicate with rarely, for them to still build consistently with what you have. And so, yes, I'm biased. I have a specs plugin, and that's been one of my passion projects for the last year. But that is also because I don't want to spend so much time manually creating all those things, but instead just want to automate it and figure out a model to clearly communicate via artifacts what the expectations are for, or the intents are behind a design.
Nice.
Yeah, that's a great plug. Thanks.
Cool. I saw another good question coming in a little later by Alexander that has to do with pilot teams. So like any adaptation of a new system, you gotta kind of figure out how to implement it. Is there any best practices you see, how that should be done, or what are do's and don'ts there?
There's a few different common anchors I think about. The first is when you're delivering a new generation of the system, you don't get the design system team into a room, like take down all the blinds, make sure it's very dark, nobody else can communicate with them, and then 6 months later they walk out of the room with a finished library. It's the opposite of that. I believe in an incremental approach. And so from the point you start to the point you launch the system as generally available and stable, there's probably a point in between there that is called beta. And that's a point, a designated point where there are enough components available built at a sufficiently high level of quality and stability, even though neither is perfect because you're not at the GA point yet, that you can start to develop relationships with the most willing and important adopters that are going to take that and integrate it into their own experiences. Those adopters don't necessarily correlate with the most important, highest revenue producing products. In fact, there's a second anchor that I also use to think about this, which is in some future period of time, imagine it's January and you're looking at the next year. Where is the system going to have the most impact? And it varies by where each product is in their own life cycle. Brand new products, the system has to have an impact. If they ignore the system, there's a problem with how the system is being embraced by the organization in general. If it's still an emerging and fastly growing product, there's probably a lot of new interface design and experimentation happening. That means that that's also should be a good fit for using the system. But if you have a big established flagship product that's starting to move more and more slowly, then the design system could be leveraged in the next year by them, but doesn't have to be. It depends on what the flagship, like big established products role is. And so if you think about from new to emerging to established to the system's not going to have a role in a declining or a deprecated product, that's going to have a relationship with how you choose good pilots, because there might be some new and emerging pilots that you can really get them kickstarted and forward a lot faster. And that's a lot better than the flagship products that move slower.
And does it have to do kind of, does it depend on how willing to take the risk, you know, as a culture and as an organization as well? Because I remember we had, I think, Ben Callahan speaking about, you know, design system is as much a cultural thing as it is like a design and a system thing, and there's certain design systems will never work in a certain organization because the culture is different. So I can kind of imagine that it works in a similar way with choosing what product it will work and it won't work.
Yeah, I think there's definitely the dynamics of culture, and Ben's talk is fantastic. He gave that talk in 2022 in Freiburg when I was there, and I think he's continued to give it. So if you look up Ben Callahan, I don't know, dynamics and culture.
Yeah, I'll share it after.
It's fantastic. I'm sure those dynamics play into what you look for in a good match with a pilot team. But you also have to think about, sometimes I talk about those as white glove treatments, because the system is still probably in a state of figuring itself out before you're stable and generally available and finished. And so there's a two-way street in how that relationship works. And so you say, we're going to be like a concierge. We're going to be very white glove. We're going to help you install it. We're going to actually help you maybe integrate a few things, because you know what you're doing. You're learning how the system's working well. You're learning how the system's ways of working, getting started, integrating packages, updating from this to that, where things are broken or where things are hard. And so the pilot programs aren't just to help those pilots get a head start or help those pilots figure things out, but also to help the system learn and bring back those learnings to make a difference before you make it generally available to all the people.
I just maybe a little bit off the thread that we're talking about. I was just wondering, do you ever get asked by an organization, or do you ever come across where you think this organization really does not benefit from from a design system, or yes, they would benefit from a design system, but there's just simply no way I can help you? So it's a little two kind of questions, but
I think I definitely do not like how our community at times characterizes design system failures or fails. Okay. I'm generally ascribed to the notion that a design system can create a significant amount of business value, and that business value after a period can decline, which may mean it's time to cease investing in that design system, or you need to let it come to an end, and then another design system or a need for a design system emerges at another time. So a system going through a life cycle doesn't mean that when it dies, it failed or it didn't have value. So like I get a little bit grouchy when people.
Yeah, I see some little irritation coming through the screen.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I will say also, and I don't know if I can show you like the wounds. I've had since 2015 only one failed design system that really did fail, but I don't think it was about the design system. I think it was about the culture and the organizational structure and hierarchy that it was trying to be fit in, where it was for a marketing site. You had very discordant, irregular participation and agreement between the design and the dev leadership, on top of all of the work, not just the design system work. And there was also just a lack of openness between the disciplines. For example, it took my company brought in a front-end developer, but we were brought in by the design lead. And so you can imagine how closed a culture is when they wouldn't let him not just get an account, but view GitHub for 2 months. And so when you start to see those kind of barriers, to movement and change, that was definitely a signal to me of, oh my gosh, this is going to be a hard client. This is going to be a hard project. How do we make this work? And by months 4 and 5, I was advising the person who was engaging with us. We still had months left on the project. I was like, you need to stop the investment. It's not going to succeed. It's not going to work. And they kept wanting to invest in it, to the point where somebody else outside their org saw all this dysfunction and the entire leadership got fired. So like, the design system failed,
Well,
but it actually was just because the whole thing came crumbling down.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, and maybe by the sounds of it, even though, you know, the project was unsuccessful, maybe the organization was better off. So, you know, it's kind
it's
of
time
like,
to cut losses and try a different way. And that meant don't do this design system here right now like this.
Yeah, that kind of links in a little bit with, I saw Leah's question, that you experience a lot of design systems that are in sync between design and dev, because I suppose that's a typical green flag, right? An organization where design and dev are really working well together already. You know, that's organizations where it's a lot easier to implement, and probably things are going to be smoother. So how do you see that?
There's a few things that come to mind. The first is, I write a lot about design and dev alignment, and particularly to form a system that's spread across both disciplines, artifacts and libraries, that reflects the same design intent. And so you see that manifested very narrowly in props and prop names and architectures and ways of composing things, and frankly, just what the names of the components are. And so there's ways to see that alignment, and that becomes a reflection of what are the rituals and ways that they collaborate to not just share and hand off stuff, but to decide together what those are. And so I don't necessarily require that the designers and developers are on the same squad, that they're all in all the same rituals. I think you can have some blended rituals and some very independent rituals of the two disciplines to proceed together side by side to create something in harmony. And that's frankly, at the larger teams that I see today, what is most common. You have a design team, you have a dev team, and then you figure out the rituals of planning and handoff and critique that you need to overlap between the two of them to foster the alignment, agree on things, and agree on priorities. The other thing that I also still encounter, one of my biggest clients last year was a design system that had a very deep component catalog, had specs of all the components, Figma assets for all the components, and the development organization just decided to discontinue engaging. They had different priorities. They didn't want to make a code library. And so there still was tremendous value serving the design org alone, but they also focused on specifications as a way to say, okay, independent development teams, whenever you encounter a design that has these components, here's how you, unfortunately, need to build all these small parts yourself. You know, do I think that's the optimal business value? No, but did the business leaders have different priorities that they wanted to focus on? Yes. And so we figured a design system can exist without one or the other. That's okay. But we still tried to do what we could to bridge as much of the gap as we could with the artifacts we created.
So maybe a bit of a dummy question, but then in the end, then you get a design system which you kind of look similar but works differently. Is that the end result?
I think the end result, in my most optimistic sense, is that you still achieved consistency. You just didn't achieve efficiency in the development.
Oh yeah, okay.
So in a sense, the experience that results that their actual end customers are having looks really strong. They've got an app, and their primary product was an app. They've got a app with expansive complexity and complicatedness, and it all looked and functioned in a way that was indicative of a good design system behind it. It just meant that every different team building parts of that app, and different development teams had to build all those parts from the ground up. So that's the waste that you ended up having. So was the system optimally successful? Oh my gosh, no. But did you still have a system creating significant positive impact? Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Again, so that's a typical case for where Brett Frost global design system, you know, that would have prevented just that.
Oh, I don't know. That that aspiration, I'm still wrapping my head around it.
That's. I mean, I've been dying to get an opening to ask that. What's your thoughts on that?
I haven't thought too much about it. I appreciated that Brad published an article, I think within the last week or two, about, for those that don't know, Brad Frost, everybody knows who Brad Frost is, but Brad Frost wrote wrote an article that projected a belief that we're recreating all these design systems. There could be a global design system from which all these other systems inherit or start from, and that would save us all as a world community a tremendous amount of time. And I think there are definitely opportunities and strengths of what he's talking about. But he also published an article within the last week or two that, as I was reading it, he said Chris Coyer had this whole podcast or article that he wrote that was like, it can't work because of X, Y, and Z. Those are kind of the things that came up to me too. And so I haven't spent enough time to reflect on those articles and understand precisely what they're doing. But what I experience within each individual organization is a continued strong desire to control naming, control the architecture of things, and also control the sort of visual architecture and arrangement of different parts. And while there are patterns that we all have buttons, all those buttons have typically icons. We all have text inputs, we all have notifications or alerts, etc. But still, the names of those things are different. Are they dismissible or not? Like, to create a super pattern for each of those components that enables you to start from but still achieve easily where you want to go, that's a really tough architectural challenge. So I'd be curious, or I will watch to see how they can accomplish that.
Yeah, and I think he also did a talk about it a couple of weeks ago with us. He has thoughts about that, but obviously, it's something which needs to grow from a bottoms up perspective as well. So it's definitely it sparked a lot of discussion in the audience there as well. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see where that's going if he puts his full cloud behind it. I saw another question here from actually a little bit older one. I don't want to disregard that, from Gene. He's kind of asking for, if there's multiple design systems within an organization, which you indicate is quite common and not per se bad, is there a natural maximum to what you can do? And how about the kind of the underlying technology then?
I think I won't start with the underlying technology. I'll start more just with a story at one company I worked with around 5 years ago, where when I came in, there were three major lines of business. Essentially, there was a line of business serving consumers, a line of business serving businesses, and a line of business serving other partners, which was actually their biggest business out of those three things. And so when I came in, there were three design systems, one for each of those, and they had vastly different visual languages. They had completely different technical frameworks and architectures to them. And so the knee-jerk reaction when you see multiple systems across what feel like parallel and potentially redundant areas is to, okay, let's consolidate them. And you have to ask yourself the question, what does the business get out of consolidating? And also, how does the target state that you want to get to, let's say one system instead of the three that you saw, it's not just about how will life be better when you get to that one system, but also how will it be more complicated? How much slower will it have to move because you're fostering design alignment and decision alignment across three major areas of business, none of which any of those power structures or dynamics has ever had to work with the others before or yield their own needs to anyone else. And so you have to think about also what you lose or what could slow you down. You also have to think about what's the change cost to go from three of those things to change all of those to, frankly, a fourth thing. Because if you're going to change, let's say you have A, B, and C, it's less likely you're going to have A stick with A and suddenly B and C are like, oh yeah, A is better. We're just going to start using A because the A was made for organization A, not for organizations B and C. And so more often I'll see a D emerge in that model, and everybody has to change from A, B, and C to D. And those costs of those three changes can be significant. You're not talking about just changing a system. You're talking about reintegrating a probably brand new D design language into all the product sets. Now, if the CEO in charge on top of A, B, and C is like, we're going to do this, nobody has a choice. Let's do it. That's not the situation I have almost ever found myself in. And so, like in the experience I had 5 years ago, the ultimate outcome was, you know what? Organization C, they're doing just fine. Let's let them continue plowing ahead. Their objectives in that area of the business are not consistent with spending time changing to D. Let's just instead create a D, because A and B, that's a business objective of that particular calendar year. Bring those experiences together because of the crossover our business opportunities are having across both those lines of business. And so let's use the design system as one of those ways of bringing those things together. So we ended up with D and C by the end of that year. And that was fine. And I suspect D and C lived on for years after that.
Yeah.
I hope my letters didn't put you off, but I had to figure
No,
out a simple model.
in my mind, they're merging. So that at least it worked for me. Is such a decision then a kind of a figure number finance driven one where you go into an Excel and you look at, you know, what are the costs, you know, what are with some risks associated to it, or is it a gut feeling one where it's like, you know, this just makes sense, let's push it through?
I think it can't be gut feeling. You've got to put your ideals to the side, because, oh my gosh, why can't we just be like Google and have material? Like that's like the ideal, except newsflash, there's Google that material that everybody uses. Then there's the one that Google uses. And then there's the other one that that particular business unit uses. And then there's 3 variants of that because areas of that business unit don't agree. And so it's not ideal there either. But the point is, like, you have to put those ideals to the side and think about, okay, in our business unit, given the different pressures we have and given where we're starting from, does it make sense or not? Is it going to create more value or not? Is it going to lead to a better outcome that is worth the cost? You have to think in those ways.
Yeah. Right. We have a very nice kind of practical question from Carl, who's an autodidact designer, front-end dev. And he feels he's implementing a design system for his products, but he's drowning in trying to migrate existing components, maintaining existing ones, and there's no budget to grow him or to clone him. So how can we help him without cloning him?
I would want to learn more before giving a really helpful, useful answer. But one of the things I see teams, particularly small teams, grappling with is as you start to want to make available lots of new components, often ascribing to a newer visual language, you have an older system or sort of an as-is system that other teams will continue to use. And the questions you'll need to answer are, first, is it okay for the old stuff to fit in with the new stuff within a single experience? And usually the answer is no. Usually, from my experience, product teams want to avoid Frankensteins, basically, of this kind of button and that kind of button appearing in close proximity to one another. Now, if the system is evolving of those as-is and to-be generations in a way that it's not really a Frankenstein, it's more of just like a patchwork and the changes are more subtle, okay, well then your openness to blend those things together is higher. So you have to answer the patchwork versus Frankenstein question and the willingness of people managing those products to live in that world. The other one is, how long will many of your customers live in the old world before they actually switch to the new world? Even if you have a bunch of emerging products that you're piloting the new design system with, and it all looks really shiny and fancy and modern, it might be that lots of other products, maybe the flagship products that matter the most, continue to slowly evolve and aren't yet going to upgrade to that new visual system. So suddenly you're needing to support multiple generations of that system. And the cost of that is like 2x the cost. It's like you're maintaining 2 libraries. You might have some efficiencies like, okay, we're making a progress stepper, neither of them have it. We're going to make the same one and make it available for both. Okay, that's an efficiency. But more often it's like you're maintaining old generation 1 and new generation 2, and suddenly that's way too much to handle. And you have to figure out your ability to make, maintain, and support each or say we have to end support for the old one and we're just going to leave the assets frozen after this deprecation period and have a end to that life cycle. So thinking about them at that big level and thinking about the cycles of generations of your system is a good way to have realistic conversations around how much you can support and maintain in parallel.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I hope that that helps, Carl. If not, you're free to open up the mic and jump on. I'm always wondering. I just had a I was talking to you earlier about like a difficult client project where maybe they could benefit from a design system, yes or no. One of my questions always is, especially for younger organizations, when do you start thinking about design system? What's the, in the ideal world, do you as soon as you you're actually starting to make products, you start with a design system, or do you usually first churn out a couple of products, get something to market, and then do it? Do you see any kind of like best practices there, or?
I think maybe a place to start is making sure that you understand what you mean and what other people around you mean when you say design system. It's fairly common for really small companies or companies that are just getting started as a startup to do an awesome job designing and coding systematically without necessarily having what you would call capital D design, capital S system in place in your company. If I was to be hired as the first and only designer, sort of mixed blended front-end-ish person by a company, would I have a design system in my own work? Absolutely. Would I necessarily require anybody else to ascribe to it? Maybe not. It'd be more just a way for me to systematically create efficiencies and consistencies.
Yeah.
And so look for that. And as your organization grows, my experience is you start to see people bubble up both in design and development as the people that care about reuse the most, that care about pure architecture the most, that really start to have skill sets and opinions and things that they're doing that really identify them as the most likely candidates to be a good owner or the starting point of a more formal design system. There's a chart I have. I can bring it up if you want me to. But it was something that I shared with a few different people, and they seem to actually. I'm going to go ahead and look for it here.
Yeah, always share, please do.
Okay, so it's an imperfect visualization that looks a lot more formal than it's intended to be, but it's the sense of like how many designers do you need on your design system team relative to the size of your organization. And so if the number of designers in your organization goes from 5 to 320, how many designers on your core team would you have? And it would be based on a ratio on this slightly exponential, whatever the vertical pattern is, which is a ratio of how many designers are on the system team, or working on the design system relative to how many total designers there are. And this ends up actually being pretty accurate. Like I was having a conversation with one of my clients and I was like, they have around 50 people. And I was like, how many designers are on your system team? And they said, there's 3. It was like right around here on the chart. I was like, okay, yeah, that works out pretty well. But you also have to really, the takeaway from this is when do you start thinking about formalizing sort of libraries of UI components and thinking about more strictly about taxonomies of design tokens and other kind of stuff? I think given where our tools and our practices are at, it might be between 5 and 10 when you start to really formalize that in a role that has at least some of their time dedicated to that. And then as you grow the design system team, you might end up with 8 here. And that's actually for like large companies like banks and so on, telecommunications companies. It might be that they have 8 or 10 or 12 designers on their design system core team, as it were.
And are these people then generally kind of their role is really, I'm the guardian of the design system or the advocate, etc., and they're not in any way busy with like designing on a product team anymore, or can they still have hybrid roles?
I think in that 1 to 5, like if you have 5 designers in your org or 10 designers in your org, at that point, these days, it's common for me to see a designer that has at least 50% of their capacity dedicated to being responsible for the design system.
Mm.
There might not be a formal design system team. They might not be wholly dedicated themselves, but there's a acknowledgement by their leadership that we're going to take this non-trivial chunk of time and you're going to be responsible for this. And then the design leader is saying, and I'm also accountable for this. If I have 5 designers in my org, and one of them is half time, that's 10% of my capacity I'm investing in creating this design system thing. That's non-trivial for a design director to be staking that claim on the value of the system. So they're accountable for it too.
Yeah, that's interesting. When you were saying this, I was thinking when you're saying, if I would be the only designer starting up an organization, yeah, would I have a design system? Yeah. Would I call it a design system? No. That kind of brings me to the question, is design systems really something like, is it really new, or is it kind of an evolvement of, if in the past a organization would be working systematically and have a solid design thinking approach or design structure approach in their organization, were they kind of already working with the design system, even if they weren't calling it that way? Because I always have the same thing more in my field. We call it UX research now, or UX. In the past, we call it marketing or marketing research. It's not fundamentally different. There's some difference in thinking, but the outcomes and what you do, the structure, processes are not that different from how they were like 20 years ago.
I think design system teams have existed for at least 20 years. So like my first design system team that I was a member of was for Sun.com. If you remember Sun Microsystems, they made servers and Java and MySQL and other things. They got bought by Oracle, but they had a design system team. It was in 2004 and 2005. And they had dedicated people. That's what their job was, to make those things. And so people being dedicated to make what we now call design systems is not new. I do think that the level of precision and craft that our tools and our frameworks and our technologies afford us now compared to 20 years ago is so much stronger that it's easy to recognize what you can create a system out of. And it's easier to then recognize the value of dedicating people to foster that operationally to scale your business.
Yeah.
And so the recognition of design system designer as a job title, that was like 2016 to 2018 when you started to see that. And so that's just one step along the way of just the recognition of the scaled value that these things can get, and thus the willingness of leaders higher and higher up to recognize and put money towards it.
Yeah. Very practical question from Sean before, I'll get to my final question. In your chart, from now on, your chart is gonna be the guide to people and seeing how much designers, system designers they need to have. How do you count? Yeah. How do you count?
Sensitizing. There wasn't a lot of research
behind
that.
How do you count the product designers?
How do you what?
How do you actually count product designers, knowing that like UX, visual, copywriting, analysts, there's
yeah. And I can maybe frame that a little bit. Like I'm at a really big company, so like we've got 50,000 employees. Obviously, not nearly even half of those are like in engineering or product. But I'm curious, when I think about like all the people that are related to the products and services we produce, like they're not all like in UX, they're not all in product, but like I'm trying to quantify like which of those roles would you roll up into the like product design or like, related to producing the tool in order to figure out what's the right size design system team.
Let me see if I can find a picture that's sensitizing enough. I've got some, I think so as to not waste everybody's time looking for a picture. I don't see, or I definitely see distinctions when I'm counting people between product designer / UX designer / visual designer / UI designer. I put all those kinds of people in one bucket. I then typically, because they tend to be carved out differently and isolated oftentimes managerially, content design, people worrying about the words, the voice, the tone, the punctuation, etc., and the messaging. I will take those and I will typically model them as a separate discipline. I do the same thing with accessibility and researchers too. I'm a UX designer in part by trade. I do a lot of research, but I'm not a UX researcher formally. I would not identify that way. And so if you have a research team and an accessibility team, those are also very common. And so when I'm talking about the head count in a chart like that, I'm excluding content, accessibility, and research from that.
Got it.
Is that on the dev side, I would also do similar things like front end and back end.
Sure.
Would be a distinction I would draw. And then lastly, I have a whole different color for product people and project managery scrummy people. And so like when I'm forming teams and I'm trying to diagram them, all those types of roles and responsibilities are distinctly represented.
Gotcha. But the chart is based really on that UX and product role specifically. Okay, cool. That's really helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And as always, since I did your training in Freiburg, I know how structured your methodology, your naming is. So I'm looking forward to the next time I'm going to see the color coding on your org charts. That'll be quite interesting. Anyway, final question, because believe it or not, we've been talking for an hour. What are you most excited about for this year? What do you see happening? And it can be private, it can be business. So what are you most excited about?
I think in the realm of design systems in my own personal work, I continue to be excited about automating things. I derive such personal reward and pleasure out of making a plugin that resonated with people that it makes me want to automate more things. And also because it created such a command of a tool like Figma, but also helped me build my skill sets doing TypeScript, which I'd never done before, really started to light up different things and help me express and explore solving problems in a different way. For example, a week or two ago, I'm starting to look at what I call shared libraries across an organization. You have a core library managed by the design system team, but there's lots of other libraries that other teams are making that are depending on the core library, but building their own reusable, often bigger bits that then other people reuse. And so to evaluate those, I can create a plugin that can create a sticker sheet and count how many variants and how many properties and what the properties names are and so on. I can just go into their Figma file and automate auditing all of those things. And that gets me excited because there is an upfront investment about it. But then to do the 3rd and 4th and 20th takes like 5 seconds. So like that kind of thing gets me excited because the tools are open enough. And I continue to advocate that people explore the disciplines and skill sets that are going to reward them the most to solve the problems they want to solve. And so, yeah, AI is behind my shoulder, starting to automate a lot of those things without needing to do that. I don't know what all that stuff means. It's all like a big black box to me. So I'm not excited about that yet because I don't understand it well enough, but I am excited about automation.
I understand that. Well, maybe you because we're going to see you in person, right, this year? Is that
correct? I am going to Belgium and New York, both in October.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I know at least in Belgium we have one amazing speaker about AI, Maggie, and I always, for me, it always was a it was indeed a black box. I didn't understand any of it. I'm not going to say I understand much of it now, but I at least have a little bit of a grasp of how those systems work and what they can do, and definitely also what they can't do. So it's really quite interesting. But I'm really quite enthusiastic to see you twice this year. Plus, you're doing a number of workshops with us as well.
I think there's some online workshops, and then at both those conferences, there are. One of them will have like the UI component design token kind of workshop, and then the other one will be planning and process. So one of each of those at each of those conferences.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I know they're on the schedule. Once the video is edited, I'll send the video around to everyone's here, including the things that you're going to. See if I can also do a friendly plug, plug for your plugin. Oh, nice little just there. We are running late. It is past 1 o'clock here, so I am as much as I am enjoying this conversation, I'm gonna wrap it up. I would like to say a little thank you. I'm gonna do a Vitaly. Can you guys do a clap emoji or another emoji in the chat to thank Nathan? And then I want to thank all people here with questions, without questions, for participating, and hope to see you people around, either in our next events online or person in Freiburg, New York, or Antwerp, 2 of the 3 where you can see Nathan. And if you're a little bit less lucky, you might also see me. All right, thanks peoples, and have a great day. Bye.